Welcome to Chapter 12, the Keynesian Perspective for Macroeconomics. We're going to look at things that influence aggregate demand. We'll talk a little bit about the building blocks of Keynesian analysis, something called the Phillips curve, and then looking how the Keynesian perspective on market forces talks about what the role of government should be to address those market forces. On this slide, I would encourage you to pause the play and just read through it. But what I want to point out, so you have two aggregate demand curves. The 0 has moved to the 1 because we count up. And so it's moved to the left. That's a decrease. But what you will notice is this strange line that's horizontal and then goes directly vertical. That's actually your supply curve here in Keynesian economics. Your short run aggregate supply. So it's a supply line. We normally would just label it S, but this is the short range aggregate or sum of the entire national economy supply line. And I'll get into why it's shaped that way a little bit later. But here you have a list of things that we've talked a little bit about that can move the aggregate demand curve left or right. In the last slide, we saw that it was moved to the left. So one of these things or more likely happened that would decrease it, because a movement to the left is always a decrease. A movement to the right is always an increase. And we're talking about what might make us demand more goods and services as consumers, or what might make businesses want to demand or buy more goods and services, or what might cause the government to demand or want more goods or services. This one's can be a little confusing, but it's the idea that as the government decreases taxes, they do that usually as a stimulus for us and businesses to spend more and to spur demand. When they increase taxes, while they have more money coming in, they generally do that to reduce our demand, maybe to cool the economy down because they're afraid of inflation or something. And so they increase taxation, take more money out of the hands of you and I as consumers and businesses. And so that's why it's listed that way. So recessionary gap is when GDP is less than the potential that it could be, and we'll look at that in a minute. An inflationary gap is when it's actually higher than the gross domestic product is greater than the potential. And that happens when it gets to a point to the right of the potential GDP, and I'll show that in a minute. What I want to emphasize, and I've said this in one other lecture, is that when we get above potential, it's not sustainable. We're using some of tomorrow's resources today. Otherwise, the potential GDP, also called the long-range aggregate supply curve, would shift right or increase. And so if we are on a point outside it, it's not sustainable over the long term unless we're actually increasing the capacity of the whole economy to do more than it used to, because we become more productive, we become bigger, we have more access to capital. So this is a good slide for you to pause on, read the comments below, understand what's happening in each, but one showing a excess of supply in terms of wages, where wages are seen to have difficulty decreasing. So we can't easily get back to this equilibrium point because wages don't come down according to Keynesian theory. So the sticky prices of wages don't allow wages to fall. And so what we end up with is an excess supply of labor, which is workers. So this excess supply is a complicated way of saying unemployment. Rather than everybody's wages dropping, or on average our wages dropping, some people lose their job and others keep earning what they used to. Over here, it's a similar thing, only it's the sticky prices of goods. And so here, the same kind of phenomena. It's harder for the price of goods in the market to drop, and so there would just be fewer of them around. And so that is a basic building block or thought around Keynesian, and it does seem to explain what we see in short-term, 5-year or less kind of increments. If you went back to 2009, maybe you had someone you care about, a parent, a grandparent, someone who lost an uncle and aunt, lost a job. The jobs that were lost during the recession, most of them, 60%, were these mid-wage occupation jobs, 20%, 21% lower, and 20% or 19%, roughly similar, higher wage jobs. When jobs came back after the recovery, 58% of them, or the majority, were actually low-wage occupations, and about the same number of high-wage that were lost, but much smaller mid-wage. And so some of these mid-wage earners, when they were able to get back to work, were earning less than they had been beforehand. And that's a concern about the current impact the pandemic could have long-term on some folks. So again, you've got stuck wages is why we have this horizontal supply, short-range aggregate supply curve. And then once we get to kind of full potential of the economy, our output, our real, our GDP, then we get this vertical that says, okay, now we're stuck because we can't produce more than this. We don't have the capacity. We're kind of at full potential for the economy. So that's the reason for that shape. There is something called the Phillips curve that is made famous in Keynesian economic theory that basically says there's a relationship between inflation rates and unemployment. And as economies, we have a choice. We have to be on this line kind of somewhere, that we're either having higher unemployment, but we get low inflation, or we can have low inflation, but we get low unemployment, but we get higher inflation. So we have to make trade-offs between those two. It's what the Phillips curve says, and it actually does predict what we see a lot of the time. But for years prior to the pandemic, what we were experiencing was very low inflation and very low interest rates, a point right about here where my cursor is. And I would say that has created a question about how much the Phillips curve still represents the relationship between inflation and unemployment rates. And there's an idea called modern monetary theory, MMT, that says you can actually have both low inflation and low unemployment. And part of that comes through governments during that as they create new currency in the market, like we did with our $3 trillion stimulus one package, and may do again if a second stimulus package is passed during COVID, that doesn't necessarily have to create inflation, that there are other uses for that money than just driving prices up. So it's a current debate on how accurate this is, but you need to understand the Phillips curve says there is a relationship. The relationship is one gets higher, the other gets lower. And so you have to make a trade-off between the two. And this is a literal graph of points showing the relationship. So in real points in history, this would be both the inflation rate and the unemployment rate, any one of these dots. And if you start to connect them in a line, you can see where a line shaped something like this would touch or make most of the dots close to it. That's a regression analysis when you do that. And we would see that it fits or looks like that Phillips curve here, and so it's in that shape. Keynes believed in markets for individual goods and services. Very much a strong proponent of market economy. But he recognized that there were times where the demand was insufficient to keep everyone employed. Remember, he's writing during the Great Depression, major unemployment around the world, and maybe the most severe we've ever seen here in the United States in our history as a nation. And so in those times, the government needs to intervene to try and smooth out these what we referred to as business cycles, these downtrends now in the economy. He didn't think that government should manage the economy to be out, but to even out business cycles, to ease some of the pain, to spread it out, and to try to help us recover from recessionary or depression kind of situations faster. And it should do that by providing goods and services that are not provided by the market, as opposed to providing ones that the market could provide itself. He believed that aggregate demand is insufficient if we're not using all of our potential supply. And so government can step in and increase the demand through both fiscal and monetary policy. And you'll see at the bottom, fiscal policy are things like the amount of taxation. Do we make it higher or lower? And do we spend more or less? How much is the government's budget? And so we can increase demand by decreasing the amount of taxation, leaving it in the hands of people and businesses to spend, or we can increase our budget as a government, even if that means borrowing and going into debt. That's fiscal policy. He believed that when aggregate demand was greater than supply, government should decrease demand through contractionary policy. So we would do just the opposite, where we would add taxation so that there was less money to be spent by individuals and businesses, and we could decrease the size of the government budget to lower aggregate demand. And then that's all fiscal policy. Monetary policy has to do with interest rates and the supply of money in the system, and generally falls into the hands of the Federal Reserve, not the president and Congress, as we would think of with taxation and budgetary spending. So here's a nice quote by John Maynard Keynes. The important thing for government is not to do things which individuals are all doing already and to do them a little better or a little worse, but to do those things which at present are not being done at all. His famous saying, in the long run, we're all dead. Just a reminder that this is a short-term theory. And so your exercise for today is really related to the one from last week a little bit, but do you think government leaders should ignore the long run and only consider the short run when they make policies? And don't just say yes or no. Tell me why you would say yes or no. So should we really just focus on what's good for the economy for the next 5 years? Or I look forward to hearing your thoughts, and hope to see you during our next lecture. Take care. Have a good day.